Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is One Piece East Blue Saga Syrup Village Arc, Episode 10, The World's Strongest Weirdo, Django the Hypnotist. Episode in a nutshell is just a brief reminder of what happens within this episode. Glahador kicks everyone off of Kaya's estate after provoking Usopp into violence, and Usopp and Luffy then learn about Captain Kuro's plan to kill Kaya and gain her fortune with the help of his crew and Django's help as well. So now that I've rewatched the episode, I'm going to rank the episode on our two ranking list. The first is mostly objective, which uses set ranking values, and the second is the personal ranking, which is more my emotional opinion of the episode. All right, so our mostly objective rank values, I've highlighted those that apply on the screen. So we'll start with our single arc main character development. This is the episode where we learn a bit more about our villain, Klahadore, or as we learn at the end of the episode, Captain Kuro. We get a flashback to his arrival at Kaya's estate after claiming to have been kicked off of a ship he was working on for a blunder he made, and how her parents so graciously and kindly took him in, and that is why he is so protective of her. So he claims. We also then later, when he and Django are talking about their plans, find out that as Captain Kuro, he set up one of his subordinates to die in his place in order to get the Navy off his back, and that this plan is basically a way for him to get a lot of money really quick and live easy off of it for the rest of his life without having to worry about law enforcement or the Navy, as everyone will think he came by the fortune honestly and legitimately. This development of the character is worth 2 points. We then also have our multi-arc supporting character introduction with the hypnotist Django. Now, as sometimes happens with characters in One Piece, you kind of feel like they are inspired by people that actually existed, potentially historically. And I feel like with Django, there's a pretty obvious inspiration behind the character. However, as I only know what I see on screen, and that is obviously not mentioned within the show, I won't say it, but if you've ever watched the show, I'm sure you know who Django is inspired by. But either way, he is a very likable villain. And he is, of course, worth 3 points. We then get an additional 3 points by the fact that we have some main plot progression. Now, on the mostly objective rank values, I basically have episodes kind of divided into filler episodes, minimal plot progression episodes that are mostly filler but have some progression, and then episodes that actually are part of the main plot and moving the plot forward. And in the case of this episode, I felt like because we were learning kind of all of the background about the villain, about his plot and his plan, that's really moving that plot forward where it needs to be. And so that is worth 3 points. We then get our multi-arc main character development, which of course is that we find out in this episode that Luffy is incredibly susceptible to hypnotism. Django says, "Look at this ring here," and Luffy immediately gets hypnotized, falls off the cliff, and is thought to be dead because nobody knows he's rubber at this point. And this is something that does actually come up in future arcs as well, his susceptibility to mental influences, which I've always been kind of torn on whether that's a good choice or not for the character, because on the one hand, I think they make him susceptible to hypnotism because he's kind of considered to be like a simple-minded character, like he's very naive is a nice way to say it. Very like go with the flow. And I think it fits there. But at the same time, when I see a character that I think of as like easily influenced through like mental manipulation, I also think of a character who is weak-willed, who maybe has very low drive, maybe doesn't know themselves very well, and I feel like Luffy has all of those factors in abundance. And so I've always been torn on like I know what they're going for, but at the same time what I think of when I see a character that's easily mentally manipulated is kind of the opposite of Luffy. But I understand that they're going more for the he's so easygoing and going with the flow that and simple-minded that this has an effect on him. I understand and get that. I just don't know that I agree that it was a good choice, and it does kind of impact my impression of Luffy as a character, probably unintentionally by the author. Anyways, having said that, our negatives for this episode. First off, was exposition in excess. And as I have said many times, I have no problem with exposition. It's needed. We need to be explained things when it's the first time we're seeing them. However, we spend like 5 to 6 minutes of the episode with Kuro and Django telling us their plan in a conversation together. And then literally as soon as they finish that conversation, Usopp then goes ahead and recounts the conversation we just listened to Luffy again. When it's back to back like that, that is when I consider it excessive. You know, like if it's been a couple episodes and we want to be reminded that, oh yeah, this person said this, that's fair enough. When we're being explained something for the first time, fair enough. It's needed. We need that exposition. Sometimes we need a reminder, especially in the longer arcs. It's good to sometimes go, oh, remember this thing that happened way at the beginning of that arc? Yeah, let's mention it. I understand that. But like I said, we literally watched the conversation and then 2 seconds later, Usopp is telling us what they said. And it's like, I just heard this. Thank you, but I didn't need that. And even for a younger audience, like I said, they may need the reminder a couple episodes in, or maybe even like in the next episode, you know, to kind of let the information sink in. But back to back like that, it's kind of pointless because if it didn't sink in the first time, it probably didn't sink in the second time when it was back to back. That's the problem. And that's -1 point. And then the -2 points, the other negative of this episode, was the negative messaging or behaviors. And this, of course, is Usopp's spontaneousness, is a nice way to say it. Anger management issues may be another nice way to say it. But words over violence. He doesn't even try words. He jumps straight to violence. And then even when he knows that it's negatively impacting Kaya, who cares about both him and Klahadore, he continues to be violent before eventually walking away. Now I know anime typically does tend to be violent, especially the shonen genre of anime and manga and such definitely tends to be violent, and I personally don't really have a problem with that because most of the time it is in defeating a villain or as a like slapstick comedy type thing. So it doesn't really bother me. But at the same time, in this case, he was purposefully being provoked. He fell into that provocation. He then committed violence very immediately without any sort of attempt to hold back. And at this point, he did not know that Klahadore is Captain Kuro, so he doesn't even have the excuse of it being a villain, though it will become a villain by the end of the episode. At this point, he did not know that. It was just her butler, an ordinary citizen, as far as he was aware at this point, that he was deciding to punch and such. And the other thing that kind of makes it negative is that he wasn't wrong. Like, the things that Klahadore was saying are what I think most rational people in the real world outside of an anime would agree with. At least I do agree with the sentiments. As I had mentioned in my previous the previous episode to this one, in episode 9, I pointed out that Usopp's admiration of his father is incomprehensible to me because in my mind a parent should not abandon their child, and if you are a child abandoned by your parent, you should probably have a grudge against that parent, not admiration for their actions. Though, something I didn't think of at that point, but I'm going to mention now because I just thought of it, and it's not fully related to this particular point, I wonder if his admiration for Yasop is like a self-comforting, self-soothing thing because he's abandoned by his father. Shortly after his mother dies, he is now an orphan who knows that he has a father out there somewhere, but obviously is not there to take care of him. And I wonder if in his mind, he grew to admire pirates and his father as sort of a self-comfort of being a pirate must be so great because it was worth more than I was. So I want to be a pirate and I love pirates because they are so great that they are worth abandoning your family for, sort of idea. If that's like where Usopp's mentality is in this, because otherwise it makes no sense. Like, your dad abandoned you, never has looked back, never has come back. Even when he was talking to Luffy about it, he was like talking and bragging about the fact he had a son, but then feeling no remorse or regret about leaving because the flag, the pirate flag, it was calling to him. But just a speculation on my part that maybe that's why Usopp's so sensitive about what Klahadore is saying because he's saying the truth, but Usopp's self-comforted into admiration for being abandoned. Just something I wanted to put out there. Let me know if anybody agrees with that or thinks that that's something that might be true. Anywho, now that I've said that, it brings us to a 9 out of 10 mostly objective score for this episode. So now we're on to our arc rankings so far for our mostly objective ranking. And so far we have the world's strongest weirdo, Django the Hypnotist, taking first place, and in second, honorable liar, Captain Usopp. So on to my personal ranking. So with this episode, as I had mentioned before, Kuro insults Yasopp. And once again, I want to reiterate, I cannot disagree with what he says. Yasopp did abandon Usopp. And while I know that the One Piece universe plays in the gray areas where there are some pirates who are very good characters, like the Straw Hat crew, and there are some pirates that are very evil, like the Blackbeard crew, for example, and that there are some good Marines, like Garp and Kobe, probably in the future. And then there are also evil Marines, like Captain Morgan and a few of the others that we get as villains later. You kind of see that it's playing in areas of gray where there's no one side that is fully good or fully evil, and I appreciate that about the show. I like it a lot. However, Shanks's crew, I think, is probably in that gray area somewhere. I don't think he's an objectively evil person, but I don't know that he's necessarily a hero's hype pirate like Luffy is. He's definitely somewhere in that gray area. And Usopp Yasopp did abandon Usopp to join a pirate crew, which, while playing in the areas of gray, would more commonly, in the universe most likely, fall on the side of not a great person, which Kuro or Klahadore at this time points out. He's not saying anything overly wrong, and then of course Usopp reacts with violence and punches him. I feel that this was a bad decision because Kaya has been established as a rather weak individual. Emotionally, she's very sentimental. When her parents died, she fell into a depression so deep that she actually ended up ill and unable to really continue to do much with her life at this point. She's pretty much bedbound. And if you have somebody who is that sensitive, and you know that they're sensitive because you tell them stories to try to cheer them up a bit and ease their illness caused by grief over losing their parents, committing violence in front of a person like that, not a good idea. And you can see how much it affects her. She practically like falls out of the window telling him to stop, that Kuro is not a bad person, or Klahadore at this point is not a bad person. And she tells Usopp that, Klahadore is just trying too hard to do what's best for her. And then, of course, Klahadore basically says, look at this violent individual. He was about to hit him a second time. You leave, never come back. And Usopp agrees to never come back. And then we, of course, as the audience behind him, get to see Kaya and how hurt she is by this, the idea that he's never coming back. And I'm just like, like I said, I didn't really like the violence in this particular case just because it's not there for comedic purposes and he doesn't yet know that he's a villain, so it's not to beat the villain either. It's just senseless due to anger. And I feel like words first, and then when words don't work, maybe in the context of an anime, but at least try the words first before you go and have him punching the butler, who at this point we think is just the butler. And also I'm like thinking about Kaya, who obviously is a very sensitive character. She's obviously mentally anguished by this. Even like when she talks to Klahadore later, she's like, self-soothing, hugging her pillow. And then Kuro kind of explains himself, but of course she hasn't gotten the opportunity to hear Usopp's side either, though she does defend Usopp a little bit in that, like, he was kind of out of line talking about his father, especially since for somebody who is effectively an orphan because the dad's gone and has no indication that he's ever coming back. It's probably a very sensitive subject, and I think anybody could understand that. She also is an orphan, so she can identify with that. I'm sure she would also be angry if somebody talked about her parents. After that rambling, essentially, what I'm trying to get at is I did not like that punch scene, and that's one of the reasons it does take me a while for Usopp to grow on me personally. I went over that on the last episode as well. So, moving on from that, we then also have like the flashback, and something I found kind of what was in the flashback of Kuro's arrival at Kaya's estate with her dad. We see a young Kaya, she has a voice, or at least she makes a sound. We then have the guards who have voices and talk, even though they're off screen. And then we have the dad, and the dad does not speak, does not have a voice. The guards respond like he said something, and he said nothing. And I'm just like, what a choice. And why was that made? I don't really understand the choice that was made there. Like, you're hiring voice actors for, like, the guards, Could not one of them had, like, faked a different type of voice and, done the father's lines too? Like, was there, like, a budgetary issue? Why did the dad, who was actively on the screen in this little flashback, not say any, like, not have a voice when he was clearly saying something because the guards were responding to what he had said about letting Kuro in? Is weird. But on to more positive notes. That was kind of the negatives for me. Django's moonwalk down the street. Obviously, he gets called weird by the children and Nami and Zoro, who are kind of sitting on the fence, kind of watching him walk up the road, being like, why are you walking backwards? Clearly a weirdo. And, he purposefully stops in front of them and goes, I'm not weird. I'm just your ordinary traveling hypnotist. Because that's not weird. And then the children all get excited and they're like, like the carrot, bell pepper, and onion are all super excited about, oh my gosh, a hypnotist, show me how you hypnotize people. And he's like, how dare you have me reveal my powers? And then immediately proceeds to get out the ring and start showing them the hypnosis, basically doing it anyways. And then this is the first time that we see that Django has a habit of hypnotizing himself as he puts all the three children to sleep and himself. We then, of course, move on to where we learn about the plan, and Kuro starts off by scolding Django for acting weird because he told him not to stand out or do anything that would stand out, and here he had found him sleeping in the middle of the street. But then they go on to discuss what Django initially calls the rich girl assassination plan, where they go over their plans to assassinate Kaya, but make it look like an accident. And before she has this unfortunate accident, Django will hypnotize her into leaving all of her worldly possessions to her loyal and faithful butler, Clahador, who has spent the last 3 years building up trust in the village so that when she does leave everything to him, it will seem totally reasonable because they're so close and he's been there for 3 whole years as compared to any of the other staff who were there for longer, like Mary, for instance. Just saying the plan sounds totally reasonable. And then, of course, they notice Luffy and Usopp. Kuro's not concerned about Usopp at all. He's cried pirate a great many days, years, and therefore he knows he would not be believed, even if he was to run through the streets crying pirate yet again, just like the boy who cried wolf. He will not be believed. But Luffy is, of course, a wild card. He's somebody new. He might be believed. So he tells Django to hypnotize him. And Django puts him to sleep, falling asleep himself. But because of where Luffy happened to be standing, when he falls asleep, he falls forward and directly off the cliff, landing on his head, which would probably have killed most normal people. I say most because I have a feeling someone like Zoro or Sanji actually might survive that, even though they're normal people without devil fruits and not made of rubber. But I would say most normal people would die after falling off a cliff head first and landing head first. And so they assume that he is dead and continue on their way. Usopp then starts running towards the village to try to warn them, despite Kuro telling him that he wouldn't be believed. But it's worth trying, and I agree with his decision that it is worth trying. Now, overall, wasn't thrilled with the episode. I mean, it had its funny moments. Django is always a comedic character, always nice to see. He does recur, and I think that's why, because he is a likable character, even though he is, at this point, a villain, though he does. Well, that's a spoiler I won't give. No, I will, because I'm not mean. He does recur on the Marine side in the future, later. But he is a villain in this one, and a very likable one. Not as likable as Buggy, but actually there's plenty ahead of him. I might do a villain rank list once I've finished the series, though that'll be years and years and years in the future, and I'll probably forget. But I might do that, because the villains in this show are amazing. And I've rambled long enough. It was comedic. There was a lot of fun elements. There were some negatives. Overall, I liked this episode better than the last one, and so I decided to give it a 6 out of 10 on the personal ranking, which does put it above Honorable Liar, Captain Usopp, which is second place, and into first place, the world's strongest weirdo, Django the Hypnotist. Which now brings us to our saga rankings so far. This is where we are comparing all of the arcs within the saga against each other. As a reminder of our mostly objective rankings so far, we have in first place the Romance Dawn arc with 86.67%. In second place, we have the Orangetown arc with 76%. And then the Syrup Village arc, we are adding 9 to the total, and that is bringing us to 16 out of 100 so far. Onto the personal side, I actually preferred the Orangetown arc, and that scored 74%. Romance Dawn arc came into second place, and that was with 66.67%. And then on the Syrup Village arc so far, we have a total score of 11 out of 100. And that now brings us to our series ranking so far. The series ranking, of course, is where we're going to be comparing all of these sagas against each other. One Piece, because of its structure, has a lot of rankings to do. And so far, with the previous arcs that we have totaled, we're at 16 out of 80 for our mostly objective ranking and 11 out of 80 on the personal ranking. With that, we've now rewatched and ranked One Piece, East Blue Saga, Syrup Village Arc, Episode 10, The World's Strongest Weirdo, Django the Hypnotist. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.